clear blue skies of the western Mojave, the tremendous margin of safety afforded by the 65 square miles of Rogers Dry Lake bed, and most of all, the utter isolation of California's high desert. These were the factors which brought the Army Air Force to Muroc in October of 1942 for the first flight of a radically new aircraft, the top-secret Bell XP-59A, America's first jet. When Bell test pilot Bob Stanley lifted the wheels of the Era Comet off the hard baked surface of Rogers Dry Lake on October 1st of 1942, he inaugurated a tradition of first flights over the high desert, which is perhaps unmatched by any other location in the free world. An extraordinary variety of operational and experimental aircraft have either lifted off or touched down for the first time here over the years since that cool October morning. And there were many firsts within these first flights. Lockheed's XP-80, the prototype for America's first operational jet fighter, made its maiden flight from the Dry Lake bed in January of 1944. The first generation of jet-propelled Air Force fighters followed in rapid succession. The Republic XP-84 Thunderjet, the North American XF-86 Sabre, America's first swept-wing fighter. The XF-87 Blackhawk, the last aircraft to bear the proud Curtiss name. The McDonnell XF-88, progenitor of the F-101 Voodoo. The Northrop F-89 Scorpion, which would become a mainstay of the North American Air Defense Command. And there were Lockheed's XF-90, F-94, and the Air Force's first jet trainer, the T-33. There were also a number of exotic fighter-type aircraft which were used to test the feasibility of various concepts. The XP-56, an early iteration of John Northrop's fascination with the flying wing, was first flown at Muroc in September of 1943. It was notable for having the first all-magnesium, all-welded airframe in history. Northrop's rocket-powered XP-79 Flying Ram made its first and only flight at Muroc in September of 1945. McDonnell's XF-85 Goblin, which first flew in August of 1948, represented an early and unsuccessful attempt to provide the Air Force with a parasite fighter. The Convair XF-92A, which first took to the skies in September of 1948, was America's first delta-wing aircraft. And Republic's rocket-assisted XF-91, with its highly unconventional reverse taper wings, would ultimately become the first fighter-type aircraft to fly supersonic in level flight. The post-war years also witnessed a number of milestones in bomber development. The Douglas XB-43, America's first jet bomber, lifted off for the first time from the Muroc runway in May of 1946. It was followed less than a year later by the first flight of the North American XB-45, the prototype for the nation's first operational jet bomber. In an era of dynamic change, bomber designs were also subject to sometimes radical departures. A lifelong dream came true when John Northrop's XB-35 Flying Wing landed at Muroc after its first flight in June of 1946. Though advanced in terms of aerodynamic design, the XB-35 was already antiquated in terms of its propulsion system. Within 16 months, Northrop test pilot Max Stanley would be easing the jet-powered YB-49 down for the first of many landings at Muroc. As he later recalled of the days when emergency or unscheduled landings seemed to be almost a matter of course, there was not a more comforting sight than that magnificent expanse of smooth landing surface that I knew simply as Muroc. Having that lakebed available, he noted, was like having the protection of a guardian angel. That guardian angel's presence was never more compelling than during the flights of the famous X-series aircraft. The first powered flight of the Bell X-1 took place at Muroc in December of 1946. What followed is well known. Captain Charles E. Chuck Yeager ultimately took the X-1 through the fabled sonic wall. Why did it all happen at Muroc? Yeager certainly knew. As he later recalled, long before becoming a test pilot, it was clear to me that here was a natural place to test airplanes. The weather was perfect, and Rogers Dry Lake was a natural place to land high-performance and research aircraft. After working on a few test programs, I began to love that old dry lake bed. It saved many pilots' lives, including my own. The procession of experimental aircraft to make their debuts over Rogers Dry Lake had begun. In April of 1947, the Douglas D-558-1 first took to the skies. In February of 1948, the D-558-2 Skyrocket made its maiden voyage en route to becoming the first aircraft to exceed Mach 2. Speed, however, wasn't the only goal, and there were a number of aircraft which would first meet the sky in search of other goals. The Northrop X-4 was designed to test a semi-tailless configuration at transonic speeds. The Bell X-5 was designed to test the feasibility of the variable wing sweep concept. The Douglas X-3 Flying Stiletto was an advanced high-speed design which furnished important information on coupled motion instability. On May 25, 1953, less than 6 years after Chuck Yeager had first shot through the sound barrier in the X-1, the North American YF-100 Super Sabre exceeded Mach 1 on its very first flight. The F-100, which ushered in the second generation of combat jets, was the first of the famous Century series to make its debut at Edwards. There followed, once again in rapid succession, a group of fighter aircraft which would make supersonic combat almost commonplace. The first flight of the F-100 was followed by the YF-102, the Air Force's first operational Delta Wing fighter. The Lockheed F-104 would become the Air Force's first Mach 2 interceptor. Then came the F-105 Thunder Chief, the F-106 Delta Dart, and the F-107 Ultra Sabre. The F-107 was the only one of the Century Series fighters never to go into production, but its maiden flight offered a good illustration of why so many first flights have been scheduled for Edwards. On landing, its drag chute failed to deploy, and the craft rolled all the way off the end of the runway. As it rolled across the lake bed, its nose gear collapsed and it continued to skid until finally coming to rest, some 22,000 feet from where it first touched down. The pilot was uninjured, and the F-107 was ready to fly again within 2 weeks. Attracting far less attention than high-performance fighters, but a classic in its own right nevertheless, the Lockheed C-130 Hercules landed at Edwards after its first flight in August of 1954. Most of the first flights at Edwards have quite naturally involved Air Force vehicles. A number of the Navy's frontline aircraft, however, have also launched their careers over the sun-baked surface of Rogers Dry Lake. In January of 1951, for example, Douglas's XF-4D Skyray first lifted off from the dry lake bed. It was followed by the XA-3D Skywarrior in October of 1952, and the XA-4D Skyhawk in June of 1954. The Chance Vought XF-8U Crusader exceeded Mach 1 on its first flight in March of 1955 and went on to become the first carrier aircraft to exceed 1,000 miles per hour. There were also some Navy craft which didn't make it into production. The Douglas XA-2D Skyshark, first flown in May of 1950, was powered by a propeller turbine combination which just couldn't compete with the new jets. Lockheed's XF-V1, first flown at Edwards in 1954, was one of Kelly Johnson's most unusual designs. An early attempt at solving the problems of vertical takeoff and landing, the aircraft never accomplished either. The jet-powered Ryan X-13, however, did. First flown at Edwards in December of 1955, the craft made its first vertical takeoff at the base the following May. The major experimental program of the mid-50s involved the Swept-wing X-2. It made its first powered flight over Edwards in November of 1955. From there, it went on to become the first aircraft to exceed Mach 3 and fly above 100,000 feet. By the late 50s, jet propulsion was beginning to have an impact on commercial air transport, and in May of 1958, Douglas's graceful DC-8 made its first flight from Long Beach to Edwards. It would be followed by two of Douglas's other successful transports, the DC-9 and the DC-10. The old adage that simple is better was the guiding principle when Northrop came up with the N-156F. During its first flight at Edwards in July of 1959, it exceeded Mach 1 in a shallow dive without afterburner. The pilot reported that transition to supersonic is so smooth you have to watch the instruments to know when it happens. The N-156F was the prototype design for the Air Force's versatile T-38 Talon jet trainer, which had actually taken to the skies for the first time at Edwards 3 months earlier in April of 1959. It also spawned the F-5 Freedom Fighter, first flown at Edwards in July of 1963. Experimental aircraft would dominate the scene at Edwards during the 1960s, and none of them more so than the mighty X-15. Its first glide flight took place over Edwards in June of 1959, and its first powered flight the following September. From then until its 199th and last flight in October of 1968, it routinely flew at speeds in excess of Mach 5 and altitudes above 200,000 feet, ultimately achieving a top speed of Mach 6.7 and a peak altitude of 354,200 feet. The Douglas B-66 had made its first landing at Edwards in June of 1954. Almost 9 years later, in April of 1963, a much modified version returned to Edwards for its first landing as the X-21A. The craft had been modified by Northrop to study the concept of laminar flow control. Thousands of tiny span-wise slots had been drilled into its wings, which by means of a complicated network of tiny ducts were connected to a pair of pumps which would be used to literally suck away the turbulent boundary layer of air, which normally impose severe drag penalties. On its first flight in September of 1964, the mammoth XB-70 Valkyrie was scheduled to go Mach 1. This plan had to be abandoned when the main gears refused to retract. Upon landing at Edwards, malfunctioning brakes locked the two left rear main tires, which both blew out within 2 seconds of touchdown. Pilot Al White and co-pilot Joe Cotton skillfully brought the craft's first journey to a safe conclusion. A funny-looking little aircraft known as the M2F1 made its initial appearance in the skies over Edwards in 1963. Towed aloft by an automobile or a C-47, this plywood vehicle was the first in a series of lifting body craft which were designed to study energy management techniques for powerless precision landings from high altitudes. It was followed by the all-metal M2F2 in July of 1966, the first powered flight of the HL-10 in March of 1968, and the X-24A, which was likened to a flying potato in April of 1969. This craft was transformed from an ugly duckling into a swan and first flew as the X-24B in August of 1973. The 1970s were dominated by the first flights of a variety of operational type vehicles. Fairchild Republic's YA-10 flew for the first time in May of 1972. It went on to win a fly-off competition against Northrop's YA-9, which made its maiden flight at Edwards that same month. 2 months later, McDonnell Douglas's F-15 Eagle, the Air Force's newest air superiority fighter, tried its wings out for the first time. General Dynamics YF-16 was anxious to get airborne. Its official first flight was on February 2nd, 1974. Its actual first flight took place 13 days earlier, when test pilot Phil Ostreicher suddenly found himself off the ground during a high-speed taxi test. The F-16 would ultimately win a fly-off competition for a lightweight fighter against the Northrop YF-17, which made its first flight at Edwards in June of 1974. Though it lost the competition, the YF-17 would be resurrected as the Navy's F-18. The long-awaited first flight of the Rockwell B-1 bomber came to a successful conclusion when its wheels touched down at Edwards in September of 1974. McDonnell Douglas YC-15, one of two short takeoff and landing transport prototypes tested at the Flight Test Center in the 1970s, landed at Edwards after its first flight in August of 1975. Edwards had been the scene of so many first flights over so many years, it only seemed fitting that the 80s should be ushered in by perhaps the most memorable one of all. On April 14, 1981, as 400,000 spectators cheered and millions more around the world watched on television, the Space Shuttle Columbia's wheels touched down on the hard surface of Rogers Dry Lake. As many as 80 different aircraft had touched down for the first time at Edwards over the years. They had now been joined by the world's first reusable spacecraft. The event was a high water mark, but not the end of the story. In August of 1982, Northrop brought its new F-20 Tiger Shark up to Edwards for its first flight, and on December 14, 1984, an experimental flight test program got underway at Edwards for the first time in a decade when Grumman test pilot Chuck Sewell lifted the wheels of the X-29A off the main runway. The unconventional craft, with its forward-swept wings, answered a time-honored question that day. Will it fly? It is a question which will continue to be answered in the clear blue skies over the dry lake bed and the wide open spaces of the Western Mojave.